How's it going, everybody? It is later than I'd care to admit. Again, on Monday, June the 24th, my newborn son's a whole month old now. And I am currently drying some clothes. I did a dry run of this on the way to work and another run of this on the way home from work, and both times I forgot stuff. So we're trying it one more time to make sure we hit our upload Monday night, share everywhere Tuesday morning deadline. So it's time for another episode of Riding in Cars with Cards. We're not actually moving at the moment, but that's okay. Normally for these, I put a poll up on Twitter, Facebook, 2 or 3 choices and let everybody decide. But I already knew what I wanted to talk about this week. I want to talk about Izzet Phoenix. It was the second most played deck at the Mythic Championship in Vegas. It was one of the more interesting decks to watch on coverage. It was played by Jim Davis to win a Mythic Championship qualifier to send him to Barcelona. And the list that Davis played was designed by Andrew Jessup. But unlike previous versions of this deck, or previous versions of this show, previous episodes, I'll get my English right in a minute, I promise. Unlike previous episodes of this show, I'm not going to talk specifically about the Jessup list or the Teresa Foe list or Jess Estefan's list from the Mythic Championship. I will put some links in the space under the Twitter and under the Facebook post when I publish the video, when I share it, that will help you find those lists, specifically the ones from the Mythic Championship, because a lot of them feel like they are kind of a continuation of the Jessup and Davis list that did so well. But instead of talking about a specific list and what I like, what I don't like about it, what I think could change, this deck's a little bit of an amalgam. Because at its core, Izzet Phoenix is a really simple concept. You play a lot of things, you play a lot of cantrips, you play a lot of cards that'll load the graveyard to load your Arclight Phoenixes, and then you play a bunch of spells, and you get your Arclight Phoenixes back. Seems real simple. And then you have other cards that you use as payoffs for playing a bunch of spells, like Finale of Promise, like Crackling Drake, like God Eternal Kefnet, like Goblin Electromancer to play them for cheaper. There's all kinds of payoffs you can play in this shell to really justify what you're doing. So I thought I would break down just some of the options that are out there and kind of discuss sort of a historical precedent for the deck. So it begins with the old lists from Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica and Mythic Championship Cleveland. Highest finish being Mythic Championship Cleveland, in which the deck posted, a top 8 finish in the hands of Luis Scott Vargas, boasting exactly one Ravnica Allegiance card, and that was the singleton copy of Blood Crypt to turn on the black half of Discovery Dispersal. That's kind of a big deal, considering the deck was one of the higher performing decks at Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica, and literally one card changed going into the next major event. One card. Just the one. That's not a lot of fundamental shifting there. So it's really difficult to categorize this deck. Because on the one hand, it looks like a Storm deck. It really does. You're just like, play a bunch of spells, get paid off for playing a bunch of spells. It's a Storm deck. Except when it's not, because the Phoenix isn't good, or because you only chip in for 6 and then your opponent has the Cry of the Carnarium and you're forced to grind. Whatever the case may be, sometimes your plan A doesn't work. And that's where it's important to have a robust plan B. And it's in looking at this plan B that I really kind of got a feel for what I think the deck really is. Because everybody will call it a combo deck. It's not a combo deck. It's not a Storm deck. It's a Turbo Xerox deck. And I've played a lot of them in my time. I've played very, very many variations on Delver in Pauper. Had I been playing during Innistrad Standard, I definitely would have played Delver until they told me I couldn't. And that's where I got the idea. That's where I knew that this was a Turbo Xerox deck. It's a deck that makes its bank. It does its thing when it's allowed to rip through a ton of cards, figure out the one it needs to beat you with, find it, and leverage it in a meaningful way. So what that means is basically your deck sorts into 3 categories. You have cantrips, which allow you to rip through your deck really, really fast. You have payoff cards, and you have interaction. Those are your 3 categories. Cantrips, payoff cards, interaction. Generally speaking, you will play a lot more of your cantrips and your payoff cards, or not your payoff cards, your cantrips and your interaction than you will your payoff cards. You look at Delver in Pauper, you look at Delver variants in Modern when Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time were legal. You look at decks like the original Turbo Xerox, like Miracle Grow. There's not a lot of payoff cards in them. You just make sure they're as powerful as you can make them. That's the basic premise behind the deck. And it's possible that we will see a new variation on the horizon with M20 because we have another interesting and powerful payoff card, this time in black. But that'll be a whole other thing down the line. So rather than discuss specifically, one Izzet Phoenix list, let's talk about the options in each category. To start with, for cantrips, I really like the idea of staying really streamlined, but there's a lot of them to choose from. You definitely want your opts. Like if we had a Thought Scour in Standard, we play it. If we had a Sleight of Hand or a Serum Visions in Standard, we play it. We don't. We have opt. It's the best 1-drop cantrip we've gotten in a long time, and it's the only one we have right now. At least for this deck. We're not an Adventurous Impulse deck. We're not a deck that wants Adventurous Impulse. So, we don't need to try to go down that road. But getting to go down the road of, scry 1, draw 1, not awful. And then we get to 2 mana, and there's a whole lot of choices here. And it's similar to what I talked about in last week's episode about Blue-Black Terramander. So the kind of the core engine here, especially if you are playing the Phoenix, and that's something we'll get to when we get to payoff cards. The core, the meat and potatoes, if you will, is playing. You want to do Phoenix if you have them, or if you can. Well, if you're trying to load the graveyard, if you're trying to go through and see as many cards as you can, sometimes go up on cards with your cantrips, it's real hard to argue against Charter Course. It's one of the best card drawing cards I've ever played with in a Standard format, and I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that. 2 mana, draw 2 is really strong. It's not busted, it's not Thoughtcast busted, it's not 1 mana, draw 2. 2 mana, draw 2 is not bad. And the fact that it sometimes makes you discard a card, or in the case of playing it in straight Izzet Phoenix, sometimes you don't have to discard a card. The card's just really, really good. Most of the time, especially in straight Izzet Phoenix, it's going to be draw 2, discard 1, which means it's card advantage neutral, but you get to look at 2 cards and essentially keep you get 2 cards, and then you get to get rid of a card you don't need out of your hand. So in that vein, it is far superior to a lot of the other 2 mana cantrips. Because you get 2 cards, and then you get rid of the worst card in your hand. Or sometimes the card you want out of your hand in the case of a Phoenix, or a jumpstart spell in order to cycle through and keep going. But Charter Course really needs no introduction here. It's been played basically ever since it came out. Or at least I tried to. Nick would be able to tell you about the blue-black deck I almost took to Grand Prix Memphis in 2018. Suffice it to say, that deck was not very good. It really beat up on the deck we built for him, but that was about all it did. So, Charter Course, really, really strong. Tormenting Voice is the other one that has really picked up a lot lately, especially because it definitely gets Phoenix out of your hand, and it definitely just trades in the dead card in your hand for 2 fresh ones off the top of the deck. That's still fine. Like, it's worse Charter Course, but worse Charter Course is kind of a low floor. Or it's a pretty high floor. Worse Charter Course means, you know, you don't get to see the 2 new cards before you discard what you think is the worst card in your hand. That's basically what it boils down to. Sometimes you get greedy and you're like, pitch this land because I know I'll draw another one, and you don't. It happens. Don't get greedy. But both of those cards are really good at enabling the Phoenix. They both, like, you can discard, especially with Tormenting Voice, you can discard an instant. Or, I mean, either one of them, really. Like, you can discard an instant, and that gives you another payoff down the line. With Finale of Promise, it gives you Finale for X equals 2, casting 2 spells, and one of them draws you cards. It's pretty good. Just all the way around, really, really good. Not quite as good as Charter Course, but still really, really good. And then we start getting into kind of the more situational ones. So Radical Idea and Discovery Dispersal were the 2-mana cantrips that were played ad nauseum in the original builds of Izzet Phoenix. They were hugely popular in the original builds. Radical Idea in particular because it gave you 2 spells in 1 thanks to Jumpstart. So it made your Phoenix turn, like when you were trying to resolve 3 spells for Rekindle or for Arclight Phoenix, it gave you the option to do so. You know, you'd get 2/3 out of it in 1 card. Essentially, like, yes, you had to discard another card, but you even if you bricked and drew land, you could just brick that land away, just pitch that land, cast the Radical Idea again, dig again, maybe you find your opt with 5 mana total for the turn and get there. Or you get really lucky and your first attempt draws a Phoenix, and then you ditch the Phoenix, and then you draw your shock with the second one, and then, you know, brain them for 2, bring back 2 Phoenixes and brain them for another 6, and they're, you know, dead the next turn. Sometimes it happens. The deck's really good. But Radical Idea was one of the early staples. It has fallen out of favor a lot. And a big part of that is one of our other payoff cards that we're going to talk about later. But, like, you know, playing a one of, or as, you know, a lot of people like to refer to it as a fun of, like, I get it. Makes a lot of sense. It's fun. I don't hate it. It's not nearly as good as any of the other cards I've talked about yet, but it's a thing you can do. But moving from Radical Idea to the other original cantrip that was played, you know, just jam, snap, 4 of on the list, start writing it down. Discovery Dispersal is one that fell out of favor specifically because of the same payoff card that helped cause Radical Idea to fall out. And that card is Finale of Promise, because you are almost never realistically going to cast a Finale of Promise that will recur your Discovery Dispersal. That is almost entirely the reason that the card fell out of favor. It's also a little bit worse than some of the others. Like, yes, sometimes it sees three cards instead of 2. And in a lot of ways, it's not that dissimilar to Charter Course, because you look at 2 cards, you get rid of the ones you don't need, and then you draw 1. So, you know, it's similar to spending 2 mana to draw 2, then discard 1, but there's just that little subtle difference where it doesn't actually affect the cards in your hand. So if there's bad cards in your hand, like, Discovery Dispersal doesn't fix that. And the combination of that problem and the fact that it's just a complete non-bow with Finale of Promise, those 2 things really push it out. Well, then we have for non-Phoenix decks, we have other options at 2 mana as well. Because once you start cutting Phoenix from the deck becomes more tempo-oriented. It becomes much more like a Delver deck. It becomes much more like the kind of typical Turbo Xerox, where your payoffs are just big dumb creatures for way less mana than they should be. With cards like Terramander and Enigma Drake, or Invade the City and Crackling Drake, and suddenly you're not as interested in getting a bunch of stuff in your graveyard really quick. You're just interested in playing a mana efficient interactive game and then making sure you have the right cards to interact. Well, at that point, then we get on the train that we were talking about last week with Anticipate and Shimmer possibility, where those 2 cards are possible even as just a one of each, because they help turn on Finale. Like they're a sorcery and an instant and a sorcery respectively. They dig deeper, even though they only give you 1 card ever. The fact that, Anticipate digs 3 deep at instant speed and Shimmer digs 4 deep at sorcery speed, and you get the card you need in a less, shall we say, unfair variation on the Izzet Turbo Xerox deck. I can understand wanting to get the right cards instead of wanting to just get a bunch of them. So, that's one of the nice things about this deck, is it's possible to build it on a budget. You can cut the Phoenixes. You can play it as Izzet Drakes. Now, it is strictly worse than Phoenix, especially in a metagame with the Fairy Time Raveler, but it's still a deck that can compete. You get to be a Spell Pierce, dive down, little bit of counter magic, little bit of removal, card selection, additional threats, instead of being this deck like the Phoenix Shell is, where you're kind of all in on a handful of payoffs and you just really want to get there as fast as you can. So, if you're interested in less Phoenix, more Drakes, I get it. Shimmer and Anticipate are great in that shell. So, moving from, and another card selection option I have to mention is Augur Bolus, which has seen a lot of play in the Jim Davis variant and the Andrew Jessup variant, and because of that, a lot of play on Arena and various other outlets. And Augur Bolus tends to occupy the Goblin Electromancer slot in the deck as a 2-drop creature that does something meaningful to what your deck does. Again, it's probably a little stronger in the Drake's deck than it is in the Phoenix deck, I would argue, where the Phoenix deck is much more about big explosive turns, where the Drake's deck is much more about building, kind of snowballing incremental advantages and applying a lot of pressure. But Augur has its place in the Phoenix deck too, because it's really, really good at beating both decks' worst matchups, which is the white aggressive decks and arguably the red aggressive decks. Augur is really, really good at blocking 2-power creatures. Like, really good at blocking 2-power creatures. And the fact that your opponent doesn't want to burn a removal spell on it because it's just an Augur, it's just a 1/3, that thing's never going to kill them. But if they Teferi bounce your Drake, you can just kill the Teferi. That seems good. Just does a number on keeping Planeswalkers away from ultimate. Does a number on, chip it in. If it ever chunks out 4 damage, like, you're doing it. You're doing what that card needs to do. And then it also helped keep you from flooding out and kept you with gas in your hand. So, I really like Augur Bolus in this shell. It's really, really good. And that lets us transition from cantrips to why we're playing cantrips, which are our payoff cards. Now, in Phoenix, it's Arclight Phoenix, because it's really, really powerful. It plays well with all these cantrips that want to put stuff in your graveyard, like Chart, like Tormenting Voice, like Discovery Dispersal, like Radical Idea. It plays well with all of those. Just get it in the bin, play a bunch of stuff, get it back, hasty Flappy Birds in their face. Really good. But it's also expensive. And it also requires a little bit more finesse in building your deck so you can get your numbers right. But it was worth it to me. I'll put it that way. I made the decision to get out of some other stuff that I've been working on to make sure I got my Phoenixes. The card's really good. Moving on from Phoenix itself, we have all the other payoffs you might want to play in an Izzet Turbo Xerox deck. The first one being at its strongest in Phoenix, but even as part of like a Crackling Drake, Invade the City, Pteramander kind of classic Izzet Drake shell, still pretty strong. And that is Finale Promise. Just obnoxious how powerful that card is. It is easily the most powerful thing we're doing here. It is the biggest reason to be interested in this deck, or this concept as a whole. Being able to spend 4 mana to cast 2 spells out of your graveyard. Like, we have Mission Briefing is the next best card that does anything like this in Standard. That you can hit off an Augur, that you can find off a Narset, or, you know, whatever. Like, Mission Briefing is as good as it gets after that. That's not very good. Because Mission Briefing gives it jump start, and then you have to discard a card, and it's just not good. It's just not good. You know, the honorable mention to a card in a similar slot is Dreadhorde Arcanist, which is actually much better in the more creature-focused Wizards deck. That's also Izzet colors and also plays a handful of cantrips and like Opt, Chart a Course, and that's pretty much it. They just play the 8. Opt, Chart a Course, get them dead. You're playing more creatures, you're playing like all the 1/3s for 2, and then you're playing Adeliz the Cinder Wind and Wizard's Lightning. It's like Wizard's Lightning, Shock, Wizard's Retort, Opt, Chart a Course, and you just... The Dreadhorde Arcanist is right at home there where it could actually pick up additional points of power and cast bigger spells. Like, it's not as good in the regular Turbo Xerox deck because you can't make it bigger so it can't cast back your cantrips. So, important to make that disclaimer because I mentioned, I really like Dreadhorde Arcanist, but I don't think it has a home here. But, again, we have... Arclight Phoenix is a big potential payoff. We have Finale of Promise as a really big potential payoff that also works really, really well with Phoenix because it's 3 spells in 1 card. Super powerful. The fact that you can get all of the advantages of Finale of Promise and then turn around and immediately leverage that into a Phoenix play is really big. And a big part of the reason why, if you're interested in Finale, you should probably be interested in Phoenix. But then we have other payoff cards. Because we're a deck that's playing a bunch of cantrips and interactions, so why don't we get some mileage out of that with cards like the Drakes? Crackling Drake. Pteramander is a Salamander Drake, so it counts. Enigma Drake, Crackling Drake. You know. These are creatures that are really big for their mana costs. In this kind of shell, Pteramander is typically a 3 to 4 mana 5/5. Sometimes it gets there faster. Sometimes it gets there later in the game and is just a 2-drop 5/5 flying. That's okay. Card's really good. I have an unhealthy obsession with Pteramander as someone, like, I missed out on playing Delver, so I never want to miss out on playing any card that reminds me of Delver, and I love me some Pteramander because of that. But the other Drakes are pretty good too. Like Enigma Drake I tried to play a ton of. I tried to play the Tobias Henke, I think he called it Teamer Riddle form, where he was playing the Teamer Energy Shell with like, but it was stripped down to its bare bones, and it was like, you know, Attune, Rogue Refiner, Long Tusk Cub, Harness Lightning, and no Whirlers and no Bristling Hydras, and just playing like a bunch of counter magic and removal and, you know, Riddle form and Enigma Drake and Crash Through. And like just making a giant Enigma Drake super early in the game. I also wanted to do a Teamer Energy variant that was like a Miracle Grow where I played Deeproot Champion alongside Enigma Drake. Both of these decks ended up being awful. This deck is not. And then our last kind of big function here within the shell, other potential payoff cards. God Eternal Kefnet. Free spells are good. Cheaper free spells are also really good. It's like getting an extra card every time you flip a spell. Saheeli Sublime Artificer is another really powerful option, especially if you're into Drakes, because sometimes she just makes a bunch of tokens, and then you draw a Drake, and you can effectively give it haste. And they die faster, and that's great. Or you can just wall up, make a ton of bodies against a white deck and just block them forever while your Drakes take to the skies and kill them, or your Phoenix Blaze take to the skies and kill them. That's all great too. Our last category is the interaction. And basically it boils down to whether you want to go all the way in on removal like the Phoenix deck does, or you want to play a diversified spread of removal and counter magic. That's really all there is to it. Do you want to play counter spells? It becomes the question. Because if you don't, you just play a bunch of burn spells. The Jessup list is some number of Shock, Lightning, Strike, and Lava Coil. I want to say it's like, I think Teresa Foe's list was 4 Shock, 2 Lava Coil, 3 Lightning Strike. Something like that. That's fine. Like that seems reasonable. But just all the way around, having answers to what your opponent's doing that also help fuel what your deck does. That's what your interaction slot is. Not dissimilar from cheap removal and interaction in the Delver decks. Because that's what we are. Arclight Phoenix is a Delver of Secrets that has to come out of your graveyard. That's what it is. Like, that's the best way I can describe that card. It's a Delver of Secrets that comes out of your graveyard. But going forward, this deck is getting some new tools. It's getting Fry from M20. It's getting, what is the other card? Oh, I forgot about it already. I'm horrible. Sorry, everyone. Anyway, Fry is really good. Takes care of a lot of problems we have, like Lyra Dawnbringer. We just can't ever beat that card a lot of the time. The new Stifle is interesting. Counter target activated ability, triggered ability, or legendary spell. So counter target Planeswalker for 1 and a blue. Really good. Having access to that, especially after sideboard, where normally you would want like a Disdainful Stroke in that slot that doesn't actually counter Teferi or Narset. The fact that Fry and this new spell both interact with both of those cards and just get them off the board, either by stopping them from getting there in the first place or by just killing them. It's really good. As far as sideboard plans go, I mean, it depends on your deck. It really does. So what I'd like to have is a really good discussion on this, like, kind of amorphous archetype as a whole. Because I really like the Izzet decks. I really, really do. There's a lot to love about what they do, the way they interact with the format as a whole, and the way that they serve as kind of a budget bridge for players coming in. Because you can play the Drake's variant on the super cheap and use the winnings by doing that to get yourself into the more explosive Phoenix decks. Like there's no compelling reason to play one version over another, except that the Phoenix deck is a little more powerful, if a little less consistent. That's really what it boils down to. The Phoenix deck is the deck that best takes advantage of the most powerful card within the shell, which is Finale of Promise. So, take a look at it, see what you think, try it out, find a list you like, and let's get a conversation going. Let's talk about this. Comment section below. Facebook, Twitter. It's going up on both. Let's talk about it. And I will catch you on, I'm either going to record Thursday night or Friday morning for my next trip down the homeward path. See you then.